The rain fell on Little Italy like tears from a broken heaven, each drop carrying the weight of secrets and broken promises. Lucia Romano ran through the narrow streets, with nothing but the clothes on her back and terror driving her forward. Her wedding dress torn and muddy, her veil lost somewhere in the maze of alleys behind St. Anthony's Church. Behind her, she could hear them calling her name, their voices growing closer with each passing moment. Vincent Castellano's men, hunting for the bride who had dared to flee at the altar, the bride who had looked into her groom's eyes and seen nothing but cruelty and possession staring back. Lucia, the voice of her brother echoed off the wet brick walls. "Come back, you're only making this worse." But worse than what? Worse than marrying a man who had already broken her nose during their engagement. Worse than spending her life as a possession, a pretty decoration for a monster who collected beautiful things and destroyed them slowly. At 19, Lucia had learned that some fates were worth running from. Even if you had nowhere to run to, she stumbled into an alley behind Torino's restaurant, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The wedding dress clung to her legs, heavy with rain and fear, making every step a struggle. She pressed herself against the brick wall, trying to become invisible, trying to disappear. That's when she saw him. Don Antonio Torino stood in the doorway of his restaurant, smoke from his cigarette curling upward into the rain-dark sky. He was a man in his 40s with silver threading through his black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. His suit was immaculate despite the weather. His posture relaxed, but alert, like a predator at rest. Lucia had heard the stories, whispered in beauty parlors and corner markets throughout the neighborhood. Don Torino, they said, was different from the other bosses, quieter, more controlled, more dangerous in ways that couldn't be measured in bodies or blood. When his eyes found her cowering in the shadows, she expected to see the same predatory interest that had marked every man's gaze since she'd turned 16. Instead, she saw something that surprised her. "Concern, Miss Romano," he said quietly, dropping his cigarette and crushing it under his heel. "You appear to be in some distress." Lucia opened her mouth to speak but found no words. What could she say? That she'd rather die in an alley than marry Vincent Castellano? That she'd traded certain misery for probable death? "They're looking for me," she whispered finally. "I assumed as much." Don Torino glanced toward the mouth of the alley, where footsteps and angry voices were growing closer. "And you would prefer they not find you?" It wasn't a question. Lucia nodded anyway, too exhausted to be surprised that he understood the situation so quickly. The Don stepped aside and gestured toward the restaurant's back entrance. "Come." Lucia hesitated. Trading one dangerous man for another seemed like poor strategy, but the alternative was returning to Vincent Castellano and whatever punishment awaited runaway brides. "Quickly," Don Torino said, his voice carrying gentle urgency. Before they reached this street, Lucia ran through the doorway into the warm, herb-scented interior of the restaurant, up a narrow staircase to what appeared to be a private apartment. Above the dining room, Don Torino followed, closing and locking the door behind them with practiced efficiency. The apartment was surprisingly comfortable, more like a real home than the sterile showplace she'd expected. Books lined the walls, family photographs sat on side tables, and the furniture looked chosen for comfort rather than intimidation. "Sit," the Don said, gesturing toward a leather chair near the fireplace. "I'll get you something dry to wear and something warm to drink." Lucia remained standing, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth and protection. "Why are you helping me?" Don Torino paused in the doorway to what she assumed was a bedroom. "Because you asked for help. Because you're 19 years old and terrified. Because Vincent Castellano is an animal who should never have been allowed to touch someone like you. You know about Vincent. I know about everyone in this neighborhood. Miss Romano, including what he did to your face 3 weeks ago." Lucia's hand moved instinctively to her nose, which had healed crooked despite the doctor's best efforts. The bruising had faded, but the shame remained fresh as an open wound. "He said it was an accident," she said quietly. "Men like Vincent Castellano don't have accidents, they have preferences." The Don's voice carried a coldness that made Lucia shiver. "Wait here. I'll return shortly." While he was gone, Lucia explored the room with her eyes, trying to understand the man who had offered sanctuary to a stranger. The books were eclectic, ranging from military history to Italian poetry. The photographs showed a younger Don Torino with a beautiful woman and two small children, all of them smiling. "My wife and sons," he said from behind her, making her jump. "They died in a car accident 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Lucia said, accepting the clothes he offered. A simple dress, soft wool stockings, a cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender. "Change," he said, pointing toward the bedroom. "There's a robe on the bed if you need more time." "I'll make coffee." The bedroom was as understated as the rest of the apartment, dominated by a large bed covered in dark blue linens. Lucia changed quickly, grateful to be out of the ruined wedding dress that had become a symbol of everything she was trying to escape. When she returned to the main room, Don Torino was sitting at a small table set with coffee and pastries, reading a newspaper, as if sheltering runaway brides was something he did every evening. "Better?" he asked without looking up. "Much. Thank you. Sit, eat something. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." Lucia realized he was right. The stress of the impending wedding had stolen her appetite, and Vincent's increasingly violent behavior had made family dinners exercises in terror rather than nourishment. "Don Torino," she began carefully. "Antonio," he corrected, "given the circumstances, I think we can dispense with formality." "Antonio." "What happens now?" "Vincent will never stop looking for me. My family. They'll disown me for bringing shame on them." "Your family," Antonio said, finally setting down his newspaper, "sold you to a man they knew would hurt you. Whatever shame exists in this situation doesn't belong to you. But practically speaking, you need time to think, to plan, to decide what kind of life you want to build now that you've chosen freedom over security." Lucia stared at him. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple, not easy, but simple. You have skills, intelligence, courage. The question is whether you're willing to use them." "What skills?" "I can cook. So, keep house. I never finished school because my father said education was wasted on daughters." Antonio leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "You speak 3 languages. You've been managing your family's finances since you were 16 because your father can't balance a checkbook. You organized the entire church fundraiser last spring, coordinating 50 volunteers and raising more money than they'd seen in a decade." Lucia's mouth fell open. "How do you know all that?" "I told you. I know about everyone in this neighborhood. The question is whether you know about yourself." Before Lucia could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Antonio held up one finger, motioning for silence, then moved to the window overlooking the street. "Vincent's men," he said quietly. "They're searching every building on the block." Fear flooded through Lucia's veins like ice water. "They'll find me. Not here. They won't." Antonio walked to a bookshelf and pressed something hidden behind the volumes. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, well-appointed room. "Sometimes, in my business, privacy is essential." The hidden room contained a bed, a chair, several books, and a small window that looked out onto the alley. It was clearly designed for extended occupancy. "You'll be safe here," Antonio said. "No one knows about this room except me and my most trusted associates. And if they don't leave, if they wait outside, then they'll be waiting a very long time. Vincent Castellano has influence, but not enough to challenge me directly on my own territory." Lucia stepped into the hidden room, then turned back to face him. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Antonio's expression grew thoughtful. "What I want, Miss Romano, is to see what happens when an intelligent, courageous woman is given the chance to choose her own destiny. I suspect the results will be quite remarkable." As the wall closed behind her, sealing her into temporary safety, Lucia realized that for the first time in her life, she was in the protection of a man who seemed more interested in her potential than her possession. It was, she thought, a very dangerous feeling, but also a very hopeful one. 3 weeks had passed since Lucia Romano had disappeared from her own wedding, and the hidden room above Torino's restaurant had become her entire world. Each morning she woke to the sound of Antonio's footsteps in the main apartment, the quiet clink of coffee cups, the rustle of newspapers. Each evening they shared dinner and conversation that ranged from books to business, to the slow transformation of a neighborhood caught between old traditions and new possibilities. "You're restless," Antonio observed one evening, watching her pace the length of his apartment like a caged lioness. "The room is becoming too small." Lucia paused by the window, looking down at the street where people moved freely through their lives while she remained trapped between her past and an uncertain future. "Vincent's men stopped coming by last week. My brother came to your restaurant twice, asking questions. I know. I spoke with him, and I told him that sheltering women from violent men was not a crime, even in our world. I also suggested that he might want to reconsider his family's alliance with the Castellanos before Vincent's reputation for brutality damaged their standing in the community." Lucia turned from the window, surprised. "You defended me to my own brother." "I defended your right to choose your own life. Whether he understands the distinction is his concern, not mine. He probably thinks you're keeping me as a mistress." Antonio's expression darkened. "Let him think what he likes, you know the truth." And she did know the truth, which was perhaps the most surprising aspect of the entire situation. In 3 weeks of close quarters, Antonio had never once made her feel uncomfortable, never looked at her with anything other than respect, never suggested that his protection came with unspoken expectations. He had given her books to read, asked her opinions on everything from restaurant management to current events, and treated her like an intelligent adult rather than a decorative object. It was so different from every other interaction she'd had with men that she'd initially suspected. It was an elaborate seduction technique, but as the days passed, she'd begun to understand that Antonio Torino was exactly what he appeared to be, a man who had lost everything he loved and learned to find meaning in protecting what remained. "I can't hide forever," she said finally. "No, you can't. The question is what you want to do when you stop hiding." Lucia had been thinking about that question for days. "I want to work, to earn my own money, make my own decisions, build something that belongs to me. What kind of work? I don't know. Something that uses my mind instead of just my appearance." Antonio stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a manila folder. "As it happens, I may have a proposition for you." Lucia felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of proposition?" "I need someone to manage the books for my legitimate businesses. The restaurants, the construction company, the import business. Someone intelligent, trustworthy, and completely outside the traditional networks that connect our world. You want me to be your accountant. I want you to be my business manager. Someone who can see patterns I miss, ask questions I don't think to ask, and help me build something that will survive even if the traditional families don't." Lucia stared at him. "You're serious?" "Completely. The pay would be generous, the work would be interesting, and you'd have real authority over significant decisions. And the catch is that working for me would make you a target for anyone who wants to hurt me. It would also make you financially independent and professionally respected. But those benefits come with risks." Lucia moved to the chair across from his desk, her mind racing. "What about Vincent? What about my family? Vincent will eventually find someone else to terrorize. Your family will either accept your choice or they won't, but that's their decision to make. And if I say yes, if I take this job, then tomorrow we start teaching you everything you need to know about running a multi-million-dollar operation, and tonight we celebrate your first step toward independence. If you're enjoying Lucia's journey from fear to empowerment, please subscribe to help support our storytelling and production costs." That night, Antonio took Lucia to dinner at a small, elegant restaurant in Greenwich Village, far from the neighborhood where she might be recognized. It was the first time she'd been outside his apartment in 3 weeks, and the sensation of freedom was almost overwhelming. "Nervous?" he asked, noting how she kept glancing around the restaurant. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also exhilarated. I'd forgotten what it felt like to sit in a public place, without calculating escape routes. Vincent trained you to live in fear." "Vincent, my father, my brothers. Fear was the primary tool of control in my family long before I met the Castellanos." Antonio cut his veal with precise movements, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me about your mother." "Dead since I was 12, pneumonia. But really she died from exhaustion. 5 children. A husband who drank away his paycheck every week. No money for doctors or medicine. And after she died, I became the woman of the house, cooking, cleaning, taking care of my younger siblings. My father remarried when I was 15. But Maria made it clear that taking care of the family was still my responsibility. Education? I finished 8th grade. After that, my father said school was a waste of time for girls." Antonio sat down his fork and looked at her directly. "Lucia, what I'm about to offer you isn't charity. It's business. I need someone with your combination of intelligence, intuition, and complete discretion. But I also need someone who understands that this work requires continuous learning." "What do you mean?" "I mean I'll pay for you to finish your education. High school, college if you want it, accounting courses, business management, whatever you need to excel at this job." Lucia felt tears prick her eyelids. "Why? Why would you invest so much in someone you barely know?" "Because 3 weeks ago I watched you choose uncertainty over certainty, freedom over security, the possibility of building something real over the guarantee of a comfortable cage. That kind of courage is rare, and it deserves investment." As they walked back to the restaurant after dinner, Lucia found herself looking at the familiar streets with new eyes. This wasn't just the neighborhood where she'd grown up, where she'd been trapped and threatened and sold like livestock. It was also the place where she'd found sanctuary, respect, and the first real opportunity of her life. "Antonio," she said as they reached the restaurant's entrance. "Yes, thank you. For everything. For seeing something in me that I didn't know was there. You always knew it was there, Lucia. You just needed someone to believe it was worth developing." That night, as she lay in the comfortable bed in what had been her sanctuary and was now becoming her launching pad, Lucia thought about the conversation she'd had with her reflection 3 weeks ago. The desperate girl who had stared back at her from her childhood bedroom mirror would never have imagined this outcome. Tomorrow she would begin learning to manage a business empire. She would start taking classes to finish her education. She would become financially independent and professionally respected. Most importantly, she would discover what it felt like to be valued for her mind rather than her appearance, her potential rather than her compliance. It was, she realized, the beginning of the life she'd never dared to dream of having. 1 year later, Lucia Romano sat behind the mahogany desk in her office at Torino Enterprises, reviewing quarterly reports that showed a 30% increase in profits. Across all legitimate businesses, the numbers were impressive, but what satisfied her most was knowing that she had contributed to those results through her analysis, recommendations, and strategic planning. At 20, she looked older than her years, not from hardship now but from responsibility and confidence. Her hair was styled professionally, her clothes were expensive but conservative, and her manner commanded respect from everyone from bank presidents to construction foremen. "The Harbor View project is ahead of schedule and under budget," she told Antonio during their weekly business meeting. "But I'm concerned about the permit delays for the Brooklyn Heights development." Antonio leaned back in his chair, studying the report she'd prepared. "Recommendations? I think Councilman Bradley is expecting additional incentives to expedite the process. Nothing illegal, but perhaps a donation to his re-election campaign, or funding for his pet community center project." Agreed. Handle it through the usual channels. It was a conversation that would have been incomprehensible to the terrified girl who had fled her wedding a year ago. Now Lucia navigated the complex intersection of legitimate business and political influence with the same competence she brought to financial analysis and strategic planning. "There's something else," she said, her tone growing more serious. "Vincent Castellano has been asking questions about our operations, specifically about me." Antonio's expression didn't change, but Lucia had learned to read the subtle signs of his displeasure, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his hands grew perfectly still. "What kind of questions? Whether I'm still under your protection, whether our relationship is purely professional, whether I have any vulnerabilities he might exploit, and who's been providing him with answers?" "My brother Tony, unfortunately." He's been gambling again, running up debts with Castellano's bookmakers. Vincent has been using those debts as leverage for information. Antonio stood and walked to the window, overlooking the construction site where Torino crews were building what would become Brooklyn's most prestigious apartment complex. How much does your brother owe? $50,000. And Vincent's real interest. Lucia hesitated, then decided that honesty had served her better than discretion in every previous interaction. With Antonio, he still considers me his property. The fact that I've built a successful life without him is an insult to his pride. More than an insult, it's a demonstration that his power has limits. That frightens men like Vincent more than anything else. What do you want me to do, Antonio? Turned from the window, and Lucia saw something in his expression that she'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but a cold determination that reminded her why other men feared him. I want you to continue doing exactly what you've been doing, building this business, finishing your education, proving that intelligence and determination matter more than family connections or inherited privilege. And Vincent is my concern, not yours. That evening, Lucia was working late in her office when she heard voices in the outer hallway, male voices, speaking in the kind of low, urgent tones that usually preceded violence. She moved to the window and saw 3 black cars parked outside the building, their occupants too professional to be anything other than hired muscle. Her heart began racing, but not with the same helpless terror she'd felt a year ago. This time, fear was accompanied by anger and a fierce determination to protect what she'd built. She was reaching for the phone to call Antonio when her office door opened without a knock. Vincent Castellano entered as if he owned the building, flanked by 2 men who looked like they'd been carved from granite and malice. Lucia, Vincent said, his voice carrying the same possessive satisfaction she remembered from their engagement. You look well. Prosperity agrees with you. At 28, Vincent was still handsome in the brutal way that some women found irresistible. But Lucia could see past the expensive suit and practiced charm to the violence that lived behind his eyes. Vincent, she replied, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. You're trespassing on private property. I'm visiting my former fiancé. Surely that's allowed, even in Don Torino's territory. Your former fiancée is a businesswoman with work to do. Unless you have legitimate business to discuss, I'll have to ask you to leave. Vincent's smile was cold as winter wind. Business. Yes, let's discuss business. Specifically, the business of loyalty. Family loyalty. He moved to her desk, running his fingers over the quarterly reports she'd been reviewing. Impressive numbers. Antonio's operations have certainly prospered since you've been managing them. I'm good at my job. I'm sure you are. But jobs can be temporary. Family, on the other hand, is permanent. What do you want, Vincent? I want you to come home, Lucia, to your real family, your real obligations. This little experiment in independence has gone on long enough. Lucia stood, moving around the desk to face him directly. This isn't an experiment. This is my life, the life I chose when I left you at the altar. You didn't choose anything. You ran away like a frightened child, but children eventually have to grow up and face their responsibilities. My only responsibility is to myself and the people who've earned my loyalty. You're not among them. Vincent's pleasant mask finally slipped, revealing the anger beneath. You think Torino will protect you forever. You think he cares about you as anything more than a useful tool? I think Antonio respects me enough to let me make my own choices. Something you never understood how to do. The slap came without warning, snapping her head to the side and bringing tears to her eyes. But instead of cowering, Lucia straightened and looked him directly in the face. Is that supposed to convince me to come back to you? Vincent raised his hand again, but before he could strike, the office door burst open. Antonio entered with 4 of his men, all of them armed, all of them looking like they'd been expecting this confrontation. Vincent, Antonio said quietly, I believe Miss Romano asked you to leave. This is family business, Torino. It doesn't concern you. Everything that happens in my building concerns me. Everything that affects my employees concerns me. And anyone who strikes a woman in my presence has made it very much my concern. The tension in the room was absolute, the kind of stillness that preceded explosions. Vincent's men had their hands inside their jackets, but they were outnumbered and outgunned in hostile territory. "This isn't over," Vincent said finally. "Yes," Antonio replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "It is." After Vincent and his men left, Lucia sank into her chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. The confrontation had lasted only minutes, but it had felt like hours. "Are you hurt?" Antonio asked, gently examining the red mark on her cheek. "I'm fine. Angry, but fine. He won't be back." "How can you be sure?" Antonio's smile was gentle, but his eyes remained cold. "Because Vincent Castellano just learned the difference between owning someone and earning their loyalty. The lesson may prove expensive for him." Lucia looked at the man who had given her sanctuary, opportunity, and respect when she'd had nowhere else to turn. "Antonio, what we've built here, this working relationship, will it survive what just happened?" "Lucia, what we've built isn't just a working relationship. It's a partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine affection. Vincent Castellano can't touch that, no matter how hard he tries." As she drove home that night to the small apartment she'd rented in Greenwich Village, Lucia reflected on how much her life had changed in just 1 year. She had gone from being a possession to being a person, from being trapped to being free, from being afraid to being formidable. Most importantly, she had learned that the most powerful form of protection wasn't being owned by a strong man. It was being valued by a good one, and being strong enough to value yourself. The girl who had fled her wedding in terror was gone forever. In her place was a woman who could face down bullies, run a multi-million-dollar operation, and choose her own destiny. It was, she thought, exactly the life she'd been born to live. Thank you for following Lucia's powerful transformation from victim to victor. If you enjoyed this story of finding strength through respect and opportunity, please subscribe to help support our production efforts and bring you more inspiring tales like this.